mantras of our Divine Mother. Our Divine Mother says to receive the divine grace, not only must one have a great aspiration, but also a sincere humility and an absolute trust. With my love and blessings, says our Divine Mother. Words of our Lord Sri Aurobindo, taken from the collective works of our Lord Sri Aurobindo, Letters on Yoga, Book 4, Section 3, Vital Defects, Subtopic Ego and its Forms, Subtopic Getting rid of the ego and of egoism. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, the need to purify oneself of ego is correct. Ego is a very curious thing and in nothing more than in its way of hiding itself and pretending it is not the ego. It can hide always, even behind an aspiration to serve the Divine Mother. The only way of getting rid of it is to chase it out of all its wheels and corners. It is the most important part of your integral yoga. The Raja Yogi, says our Lord, are right in putting purification in front of everything and a preliminary to successful meditation. You have to look around you to see that the experiences and even realizations cannot bring one to the goal if this is not done. At any moment they can fall owing to the vital still being impure, full of ego. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, the elimination of egoism is the first requisite of a true foundation in the sadhana. It is because people do not realize this and are satisfied with experiences, keeping the vital ego, not insisting on an egoless higher consciousness that is there, that there is so much difficulty. Obviously, all that must go. It is the old vital egoism of the human being, always preoccupied with itself, so that the being cannot give itself simply and unquestioningly to the adoration of the divine. It is from looking at things from the ego point of view that there comes all the confusion and trouble and ignorance. One has to think of the divine, be still, and let the divine consciousness come in and replace the egoistic human. Then all that disappears. All attachment and ego must disappear. No temptation of power, for power is given only to do the divine's work, and the power itself is the divine's. No attachment to work, for the work is not the ego's but the divine's. No attachment or insistence on the fruits, for that too belongs to the divine and will come when mind and circumstances are ready. It is the same with the sadhana. Only one thing is to be the aim, to be in union and contact with the divine through love and surrender. The rest will come out of that, whatever is needed for the manifestation. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, if the ego is gone and the full surrender is there, then there should be no obstacles to follow the sunlit path of sadhana. If, however, the rajas of the vital is only quiescent, then its quiescence may bring up the tamas in its place, and that would be the obstacle. Only calm in the vital is hardly sufficient to have psychic experiences. There must be something throwing out the ego from the vital. The ego and the vital always resist a pressure to get rid of them. If one fixes a given time, they are all the more resistant in the hope of creating disappointment and discouragement by the failure to do it in the given time. You cannot expect to drive the ego out of the moments in a very short time. What is necessary is to see it quietly without being discouraged by its presence, and by a steady, persistent action work it out of the system. It is not possible, says our Lord Sri Aurobindo, it is not possible to get rid of the ego moments all at once. They have to be worked out of the nature by a constant consciousness and rejection. Even when the central ego has gone, the habitual moments stick for a longer time. These little expressions of egoism either fade slowly out by constant rejection, or else they drop off when the higher consciousness gets steadily down into the lower vital, as it were, swallows it up. A sudden extinction is perhaps possible. At least there are some reported cases, but usually they do linger and go slowly, losing gradually force as if worn out. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, for the ego, however insistent it may be, one has to keep one's eye on it and say no to all its suggestions, so that each position it takes up proves to be a fruitless move. Treated in that way, it becomes ready for the moment when the psychic has only to give a slight push for it to fall away in each field of its activity from its loosened roots. Persevere steadily in the present moment, and it cannot fail to be effective. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, ego is not so easy to get rid of. It remains not only in spite of work, but in spite of knowledge or bhakti. The disappearance of ego means complete mukti. But even the yogi who feels his separate being swallowed up in the cosmic consciousness or some kind of transcendental consciousness, yet when it comes to outward action and reaction, finds the superficial ego still there. That is why the aesthetic has an horror of action. That is why the ascetic has a horror of action and says that without ego it cannot be done. It can, but fully, only when these outermost things are finally taken up by the higher consciousness entirely. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, if you think there is no ego or desire in you, only pure devotion, that shows a great unconsciousness. To be free from ego and desire is a condition which needs a high siddhi in yoga, in integral yoga, Even many yogis of a great spiritual attainment are not free from it. For a sadhak at your stage of development to think he is free from ego and desire is to blind himself and prevent the clear perception of one's own nature, movements, which is necessary for progress towards spiritual perfection. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, the mother does not need to have your writings before her in order to see what is in you. If your writings show ego and desire, they certainly do. It is because they are there without you perceiving it and express themselves without your intending it. What the surface mind thinks and intends is one thing. What the surface mind thinks and intends is one thing, and what is behind the thoughts and actions is another thing. A man's surface mind shapes its own idea of oneself and one's nature in an entire self-ignorance. The first thing one has to get rid of this ignorance is to draw back from the surface mind and get into contact with the psychic, which does not allow such delusions and shows one clearly the truth about one's moments. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, even if there is no consciousness of ego in the higher paths, where oneness of all things have been realized, it does not follow that in the lower paths, ego has been abolished. It can, on the contrary, become very strong, and the actions can be very egoistic, even while the mind is thinking, I have no ego. One can be an instrument to help someone else on the path of yoga are meant to wake the ego. I suppose they persist because they still have a hope of waking the ego. Even when one is quite free, all kinds of suggestions can come. One either takes notice of them or else gives a glance to see whether there is any fragment of ego still lurking somewhere. Next subtopic, getting rid of the ego altogether. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, but what is this ego of which you speak? Everybody has the ego, and it is impossible to get rid of it altogether except by two things. One, the opening of the psychic within, and second, the descent of a wider ego-free consciousness from above. The psychic being opening does not get rid of the ego at once, but purifies it and offers it all the moments to the divine, so that one becomes unegoistic through self-giving and surrender. At the same time, the nature opens above and the wider ego-free consciousness comes down and ego disappears. And by the power of the psychic, your own true being, which is a portion of the Divine Mother. This is what has to happen, but it cannot happen in so short a time. Do not always be thinking of the vital moments and the ego. You have seen them and know that they are there. It is enough. Concentrate rather in the heart on the opening there. Concentrate persistently and aspire persistently, and do not mind if it takes time. Call in any way, even if you cannot call yet deeply, then the deeper call will come. It is possible to diminish the ego by the action of the force if your consciousness associates itself with the action. Then at least one can get rid of its major action and leave only minor traces. To get rid of the ego, says our Lord, altogether, however, comes usually only by the descent of the consciousness from above and its occupation of the whole being, aided, of course, by the rule of the psychic in the nature. I think you still give an exaggerated importance and attention to the ego and other elements that are interwoven in the nature of humanity and cannot be entirely got rid of except by the coming of a new consciousness which replaces them by higher moments. If one rejects centrally and all with all the sincerity the ego and the rajas, their roots gets loosened and sattva can prevail in the nature. But the expulsion of all ego and rajas cannot be done by the will and its effort. After a certain stage of preparation, therefore, one must stress more on the positive side of the sadhana than on the negative side of rejection, though this, of course, must remain to help the other. Still, what is important is to develop the psychic within, bring down the higher consciousness from above. The psychic, as it grows and manifests, detects immediately all the wrong moments or elements and at the same time supplies almost automatically the true element or moment which will replace them. This psychic process is much easier and more effective than that of a severe tapasya of purification. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, the higher consciousness in descending brings peace and purity into all the inner parts. The inner being separates itself from the imperfect outer consciousness, and at the same time, the peace that comes carries in it a power which can throw out what contradicts the peace and purity. Ego can then slowly or swiftly but surely disappear. Rajas and tamas change into divine substitutes. It is rather a wider than a higher consciousness that is necessary for the liberation from the ego. Going high is necessary, of course, but by itself is not sufficient. Without persistent rejection of the liberation from the moments of the ego, it cannot be done. Going up into the self liberates the higher parts, but the ego remains in the lower parts. The most effective force for this liberation is the psychic control with steady rejection. Our Lord says the sense of ego can disappear into that of the self or the Purusha, but that of itself does not bring about the disappearance of the old ego reactions in the Prakriti. The Purusha has to get rid of these by a process of a constant rejection and remolding. The remolding consists in throwing everything into a consecration to the Divine Mother and doing all for her without regard to oneself, one's desires, opinions, vital reactions, as if they were the things to be fulfilled. This is most easily done if the psychic being becomes quite awake. Without the liberation of the psychic and the realization of the true self, the ego cannot go. Both are necessary. Is there no consciousness of the self? If there is no consciousness of the self, how can the ego disappear? The psychic can be liberated by love and devotion. But I was speaking of a case in which it is not so liberated and the realization of the self seems more easy a case, very easy to handle, says our Lord. Sure, Aurobindo.